From one single cocoa bean, we could grow as much as basically the entire Amazon rainforest, all starting with one single bean.
Today I'm sitting down with Alan Perlstein, the co-founder and CEO of California Culture. Many of you have probably heard that our global chocolate supply chain is pretty much a mess between deforestation, child labor, and price instability due to rising demand.
Most of the warehouses in the world are almost completely depleted from cocoa today.
We need alternative solutions, and this is what Alan and his team are working on. They are making cell-based chocolate by making cocoa inside of bioreactors and skipping the farm entirely.
This is what we think is going to be the future of biomanufacturing. Small, quickly deployable systems that could basically produce the vast majority of ingredients.
Now, California Cultured sits right at the intersection of industrial biomanufacturing, decentralized food production, and domestic supply chains, so it's perfect for the lens of going direct.
We've been tricking the cells to get up to 20% of its weight, so over 20x improvement in concentration.
Alan is a scientist and spent his entire career in cell-based production of food, so I think you'll find this an enlightening and interesting conversation. I hope you enjoy it, and remember to go direct. All right, we are live, and I have Alan Perlstein with a background of chocolate for those of you just listening. How you doing, Alan?
I'm doing great, Jordan. How about yourself?
I'm doing good, man. I'm doing good. I had a great weekend with my son. I took him on a little boys' weekend, so it was really fun. So coming back to this week, nice and energized. So we're here today to talk chocolate and coffee as well, but mainly chocolate. And obviously, what you and your team have invented and are working on hits square, like smack dab in the middle of a lot of the themes that we talk about going direct, which is decentralized production, shortening supply chains, decentralizing the real economy, and the heart of that being production, which you guys are all tackling. So I think it's a highly relevant conversation. But I want to start here, a little chocolate 101 for folks, okay? Just explain how chocolate is made traditionally.
Yeah, currently almost all the chocolate in the world is grown in 3 locations: West Africa, Central America, and over the last couple of years, Southeast Asia has started significantly increasing their production. Chocolate has traditionally been grown in South America, but unfortunately, due to massive amounts of disease and deforestation in the beginning of the 20th century, most of the production, roughly about 70%, is now located between the Ivory Coast and Ghana. Currently, chocolate needs roughly 5 years to mature if you plant basically a little cocoa bean. After about 3 to 4 years, the chocolate plant matures and it starts producing pods. It only fully matures maybe somewhere between 5 to 8 years. After that, you have these cocoa pods. They're usually the size of a smaller football. They have about 20 to 30 little cocoa beans inside of them, surrounded by this fruit, it's cocoa fruit. It's sort of like a sticky, mushy, adherent pulp that connects to the beans itself. Usually, cocoa farmers would crack open these pods, combine all these beans in basically buckets. They bring them to a fermentation hut or to a location in the jungle, which they ferment. They have these big wooden boxes covered with pine leaves, which they then ferment the cocoa anywhere from 2 to 5 weeks, depending on the cocoa flavors. They would usually mix the beans every couple of days, and what happens is a mix of bacteria and fungus ferment these beans and break down these really bitter compounds that are very hard for people to really enjoy. After that, the beans get dried on the forest floor, usually for about a couple of weeks. Then they get packaged and given to different messengers that go from messenger bike to truck to large truck, then to warehouse, then to port warehouse, then on ships. Then it goes through roasting in one part of the world, then it gets shipped to somewhere else, then it gets ground, then it gets shipped somewhere else, then it gets squeezed, and then after the cocoa butter and cocoa solids get separated, it gets recombined into chocolate. And that usually takes the whole process well over a year plus from start to completion. And that's currently how chocolate has been mass produced and consumed for close to 100 years.
Wow. So it takes a year from the cocoa bean. The 1 year from once the cocoa bean has been fermented, then it gets distributed out to go through the process, and the chocolate bar ends up basically in someone's home or
Yeah,
okay.
even longer because many times these bags usually have to sit in warehouses and negotiate it over. And there's incredibly long lags between even growing it and having a final product or even arriving in the warehouse. It could usually be there for half a year plus. But right now one of the biggest problems is that there's truly no warehousing of cocoa. Most of the warehouses in the world are almost completely depleted from cocoa today.
And obviously, a big piece of this has been, I believe, Ghana's been pretty devastated and with weather and just the crop and over farming. And is this like is it just a mix of everything coming together? It's a mix of increased demand as well as
Yeah.
climate change. Is it just everything coming together?
It's not only the regular customers like Americans and Europeans, but right now the demands for chocolate are becoming a lot more large in places like South America, Africa, India, and China. All of these places that are basically moving through the economic food chain, and they're really starting to appreciate different parts of westernized foods and treats. And probably one of the biggest examples of this is Luckin Coffee coming in from China. Their demands for bakery goods, chocolate, and coffee are being introduced through these cafes, which have been growing faster than almost any Western coffee shop. I think from last read, the demands for some of these new foods are getting close to 200% above traditional targets. So we see a completely new supply chain needing to exist just to even fulfill these large demands coming in from all over the world.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, we've spoken over the past few years a lot about this, but it's fascinating to me when you think about how do you utilize biology and technology to create produce things like in critical areas where it's clearly not going to be sustainable. Not even in the long term, but I think it's quicker than most people even think. I think chocolate and cocoa is like on the top of the list from kind of my research and the conversations that we've had. So I think let's move over to obviously kind of what California culture is doing a little bit, but just I think the concept of cell cultured chocolate and skipping the farms and growing them in tanks. And so kind of let's break that down to what you guys are actually doing and what actually plant cell culture is.
Yeah, so plant cell culture is basically the process of taking a tiny little cutting from any single plant and basically tricking those plant cells to thinking they could grow roots or leaves or whatever our target end goal is. For instance, what we're doing is we're tricking cocoa beans to grow infinite amounts of cocoa bean tissue. And that means from one single cocoa bean, we could grow as much as basically the entire Amazon rainforest and the entire forest cover of Africa combined, all starting with one single bean. So that's in essence its potential.
And so, I think most folks probably that haven't been in the world of cell cultured production and industrial biotech may have heard kind of the concept of lab grown meat or cell based meat. And so, how would you describe? Is it a very similar process, but you're obviously using plant cells instead of animal cells? Just kind of break that down.
Yeah, this is more close to what we would think of a brewery. You're basically taking lots of sugar, you're feeding it to different living things. They usually consume the sugar and either grow and divide or produce alcohol. And for us, we're getting the cocoa cells basically just to grow and divide and produce all these delicious cocoa compounds that are natively found from the cocoa bean. So we like to call it our own cocoa brewery, if you will.
So so let's kind of walk through the production process a little bit more. So obviously you just mentioned the process of fermentation. You're feeding the compounds a bunch of sugar. You're making them grow. But then from there, just talk about how that goes to actually making cocoa and
Sure.
chocolate, I guess.
So yeah. So we basically have to spend about 2 years tricking the initial cells to produce these flavors and cocoa butters as well as bioactives. Once we're basically confident that these changes are permanent inside of the cell and we're able to do this without genetically modifying the cell line, basically by using traditional agricultural technologies but in a newer way. And once we put these changes into the cell, we could basically put them in these large tanks filled with sugar, water, and we mix it with air and different gases also found in the air. And after a couple of days, the cells start growing, dividing, and the whole tank fills with these cocoa cells. We remove them into another tank where we have a whole bunch of other microbes and yeasts, which then degrade the cocoa cells into more chocolatey tasting products. And from there, we rinse, roast, and are able to grind it into the chocolate that we know and love. And we can do that for multiple different applications, as well as figure out how to make different unique aromas and fat profiles of cocoa, which we're finding it could create different mouthfeels and textures and flavors which are impossible to produce today.
Can you just dig into a little bit when you're using the term trick the cell? So the trick
Yeah,
the cocoa cell. Let's dig into that so folks can better understand that.
sure. So usually how many different plant cells are grown, like if you're starting with a seed, there are these small plant hormones inside of that seed. And they basically tell the seed of what to grow into or different parts of the seed to grow into. So we basically learned to decipher this language of how the plant basically communicates to itself. So we basically take these plant signals and see where else in nature they're basically found. For instance, one of the big plant signals we use is a compound called zeatin that is found in very high levels in tomatoes, in rice, in coconut water. So we basically take specific amounts and concentrations and mix it with other compounds found in other fruits from pineapples, yams, rice, soybeans, and mix it all together and feed it within very specific concentrations and at specific times to the cells. And that basically tricks the cell into thinking it's still growing and dividing in its natural habitat. And this now allows us to control how it grows, what types of the cell mass could grow, like cocoa butter versus fiber or protein. And from there, that gives us a basic infinite toolbox to control how the plants are going to grow in these large tanks filled with sugar and what they're going to taste like.
Great. Thank you for that. So there's like a whole reorientation of production, right? So just to kind of summarize for folks that aren't familiar with the process, I mean, you're essentially that entire supply chain and everything you were mentioning at the beginning of the pod. I mean, you're bypassing all that, and you're essentially just doing that right now. And you're in a facility in right outside Sacramento, correct?
Yeah, we have a 12,000 square foot facility that we've been building in West Sacramento. Right now, we've just started producing a couple 100-pound production, and soon we're going to be in multi-ton production, which is very exciting. This can allow us to start actually supplying our first partners by the beginning of next year.
Great. All right, so let's talk about distribution because I think this is where most industrial biotech companies have a difficult time. They don't think through, and they end up getting stuck. And unfortunately, as we all know, I think many of many of the promises of industrial biotech really haven't come to fruition at the scale that many people would have hoped. And a lot of times, it's because of this supply chain piece. And many of these supply chains are dominated by some very large players. And I know so California culture is make. Correct me if I'm wrong, but you're making ingredients and you're selling to large chocolate makers. Is that correct?
Yes, we
So talk,
are. We
yeah.
Yeah.
So talk to me just about kind of how you, at the beginning when you were thinking about distribution and why you chose the route that you chose.
Well, the biggest reason is I sort of saw firsthand that it's not only incredibly challenging to create a new bioprocess and and make it taste good and then scale it up that you could actually do it at a much larger amount. One of the big problems is you have to show it to people. You have to teach them about it. You have to get it in front of their grocery cart in the supermarket, and that is a completely different animal than pushing technology. That requires tons of contacts, crazy large rolodexes, as well as huge amounts of capital. Because guess what, if you're coming in with a product and want to sell it in the store, many groceries are going to require you to have stocking fees and labeling fees and every single type of fee that's imaginable. And for any type of startup, that's just so incredibly difficult to do. So our focus is, let's focus on what we're experts on in the world and what we could do better than anyone else, is figuring out how to make this amazing type of chocolate using this new technology. And the thought process is, let's find some of these big partners who want to already use this type of ingredient, or to basically make sure that the prices that they're going to charge consumers isn't going to skyrocket. So we figured out a partnering with a couple of very large chocolate companies, as well as some ingredient companies and companies that are focused on distributing ingredients at scale. And that was sort of a little bit of our tactics of how we thought that we could sort of tackle that, even though that wasn't going to be relevant for us for a couple of years. But finding the investors that could basically not only give you capital to push your R&D, but also have these incredibly well built out supply chains is really one of the best options for many biotechs today.
One of the big knocks of industrial biotech is being able, especially in the commodity space, to be able to deliver it at obviously a reasonable or competitive cost. So just talk to us about kind of for you the roadmap to cost parity and what you're seeing from a cost standpoint versus your traditional cocoa.
Yeah, traditionally biomanufacturing was seen as one of the answers of how could you make the things we like without, destroying the environment, killing many animals, and especially having it at a more competitive price. Just to sort of set the stage, literally in 2025 is the 100-year anniversary of one of the first bioprocesses that ever occurred, actually producing citric acid at scale. Was basically a very big problem around World War I, and they figured out how to basically make these little yeasts produce citric acid for a price competitive amount compared to the lemons they had to get from all over the world prior to World War I. But by 1925, they figured out how to massively produce enough citric acid that it became cheaper than traditional amounts, ways of producing it. And that was sort of our North Star. How could we actually get to a price point lower? But we thought people don't want to wait, customers don't want to wait, investors don't want to wait a couple of years for that to happen. So we were looking, okay, if we could control cocoa, how could we actually produce a product that could bring in really great margin that we could produce for competitive price manufacturing costs today? So we focused on the healthy part of cocoa, a cocoa flavanol, that we could actually start selling at a premium that is technically even lower than what you could find on today's market. And the idea is to use our technology to scale up this more premium product to showcase that the technology could work, showcase that the scale up could work, and showcase that it could be sold repeatedly to our customers at below the current prices. And once we have that sort of locked in, the vision is to then have these other ingredients that we could produce from cocoa. And as our scale increases, our costs for manufacturing decrease. And that can allow us to enter eventually more competitive products like cocoa powder and traditional chocolate. So, over the next couple of years, as we're going to be launching products, we're going to be able to get lower and lower in price as our scale increases.
Can you explain the flavonoid market a little bit more, or just most people probably aren't even don't even know what a flavonoid is? So
Sure.
just talk about that.
So I'm sure most people have heard dark chocolate's healthier than milk chocolate. And the reason is these flavanols. Flavanols are basically found in lots of different plants, but they're especially high in cocoa because they're used to fend off different viruses and bacteria that the cocoa usually faces in its native environment. But when humans consume these flavanols in cocoa, they have a profound benefit. They basically get digested by your gut microbiomes, and they produce these compounds called minus epicatechin, and that basically interacts with different mitochondria in the heart, joints, and brain. And what that does, it seems to act as this anti-inflammatory. As mitochondria consume energy that feeds our cells, they unfortunately get damaged. And it seems cocoa flavanols, and specifically this compound, minus epicatechin, sort of lessens the damage that the mitochondria undergoes just through normal functionality. And that seems to have an anti inflammatory effect on cardiac tissue, joint tissue, and even improve short term memory, as some studies that the chocolate company Meiji has performed. So we've been seeing a lot of scientific evidence coming from UC Davis, Columbia University, universities all over Europe, showcasing how it can actually be beneficial for human health. So about a year and a half ago, the FDA just allowed the first claims to be used for these cocoa flavanols. And we've also been seeing a huge spike in these other companies also trying to sell cocoa flavanols for longevity, for memory, for even skin health. So we see all these benefits for cocoa flavanols, and we're very proud to actually bring to market a cleaner version of the cocoa flavanols, as well as having it more competitively priced than probably anyone in the world.
You talk about, I'm going to shift back over to distribution for a minute. 'Cause I think it's an important point. Obviously, you mentioned kind of taking the route of working with some of the large, Meiji is one of them you mentioned, some of the
Yes.
largest chocolate producers in the world. And, is the best way to get your product to market. Many folks in the industrial biotech space and biomanufacturing space, it's a really big challenge, as you mentioned, as you're starting up, because it's how do you protect yourself and your IP and like the approach you need to take to where you're actually not controlled by these very large companies when you're at such an early stage?
Yeah, that is always a very difficult challenge. IP takes a long time to develop, and then IP in itself is more used as an offensive weapon than a defensive weapon. So, in order to utilize that IP to whack over another company's head, you need hundreds of thousands of dollars for that. So, I'm not saying the IP is not important. It definitely is,
Mm.
especially when you're negotiating with these large corporations. The idea is, in order to work with them, you have to constantly work on developing IP, as well as most likely work with a couple of different potential competitors to make sure that no one has enough control. Then, on top of that, you also have to move incredibly fast. The world is shifting so quickly, and speed is probably the best advantage that small startups have. So it's creating technology quickly, figuring out how the best way to protect them through IP or trade secrets, figuring out how you could leverage those pieces of IP with bigger partnerships and maybe utilize some of these partnerships for offensive litigation if you need to, or trying to understand how you can have these big long-term partnerships also built in, but in a way that it doesn't limit your mobility. In essence, many companies have to just move very quickly, grab as many large partnerships as you possibly can in order to make sure that you're not tied down to any negative stipulations which might just sink your company or make or sort of sabotage your company. You have to be very agile and honestly make sure that your partners can commit to you as well. And that's another important thing. Trying to get the LOIs done as quick as possible, translating that into offtake agreements or partnership agreements as fast as possible, and making sure that they're not too onerous or difficult to execute. And making sure potentially that you could also have some seriousness fees as well, because many companies just like spinning your
Yeah,
wheels,
fishing. Yeah.
wasting time, going on a fishing expedition. So the only ways to make sure that doesn't happen is to then enforce, okay, if you want to talk with us, we're going to need at least a minimum amount of revenue coming in from every single month to make this real, or for payment to happen. So I think a mix of these different tactics and strategies, I think, is probably one of the best ways that these biotech companies can really perform well without shooting themselves in the foot in the process.
How What have you found is the main? Well, let me step back. Usually, when a large corporation, they're the way that they make decisions and they have shareholders and maximize shareholder value and go on and on and on. Um, they're typically going to look to change their supply chain or change the way that they do things if it makes sense, if the numbers make sense. And so, if you were to step back and say the large companies that you're working with, what is the main reason why they want to work with you?
So we thought about this and talked with lots of people within the industry, and we sort of nailed this down to five reasons why. Number one is can your technology help the company look better to their shareholders and to the public in general. That's usually a big one. Is the company actually investing in the right R&D internally and externally to make sure that their stock market, their stock price goes up to the right? That's usually a very good one to have. Number two is if the technology you're developing is so critical to their ways of making money that that if they're not talking to you, it would be seen as a risk. So that is another very important goal. So talk to the companies that are doing your thing. Third of all, what types of potential personal relationships, or deeper motivations does the people you're talking to have with your company? Do they think it could potentially help their career or make them look better or help their department grow? Or is it something that they need to see or do? There are all these hidden motivations that are very hard to take out. Another part is potentially fear. Many companies are also sometimes they're projecting or seeing crud, one of our prices of our products is going to be so high in the future that it's going to really destroy these SKUs. How could we plant the seeds today to prevent that from happening? And number five is if we could basically showcase a really innovative technology that they would really want, or sometimes many companies have big ideas of what they want to achieve in the future, and they might look outside. You might have this great technology that we could integrate, and then that could allow us to launch these other products or other ingredients. Like, imagine how long some companies had to wait for the right battery technology to allow some technologies to work or some sensors to work. So what we're trying to do is unlock these types of technologies, which can, what we think, open up eventually hundreds of new SKUs and products which were impossible to produce before.
When you look at your process, you go back to kind of the underlying technology and what that enables. And if you think about what California culture is doing, if you pull this off at scale, it's going to be pretty remarkable on many levels. And what you're doing is really, really difficult from a technical standpoint. So how I think about it is you kind of have the biology component, you have the flavor chemistry, which you talked a little bit about, and then you have the entire scale up and production. So that includes bioreactor design and being able to get these cells to behave and perform in larger quantities, which is a whole other animal. So when you think about kind of those three pillars, like what's the most difficult to crack? Or are they all kind of pretty much equally difficult in their own way?
The probably one of the biggest ones that is potentially even affecting the greater biomanufacturing industry is about the cost of production and how you could get your unit economics basically to beating commodity prices. And unfortunately, there is no significant capacity for many companies to actually achieve these goals because usually these bioreactors are made out of steel. They require extensive engineering and significant amounts of power. We're talking about heavy industrial power. And that's very difficult, especially today, to basically build out. And we honestly see that the price of steel, guess what? It's going up to the right because of all these data centers that are in demand for all over the world. The price of power, guess what? It's also exploding. And there's just not enough capacity being out there. And even the price for the regular consumers that you're going to pay to just light your home is going up. So we saw that some of these issues are just so, I think, not only locked in, but there's very few ways to maneuver. So we sort of saw that happening in 2020. And our intent was basically how could we actually scale up in a way that that doesn't block us, from hitting our goals. So we sort of were inspired from the original beer and wine industry, just like the original biomanufacturing was inspired from them in the beginning of the 1900s. So we saw, what are they doing? And we saw that there's a whole ton of microbreweries, home breweries, a whole bunch of new fermentation technology that's basically been built over the last 40 years, but no one has really taken that to any other sector except for beer and wine. So we saw, why can't we just grow cocoa cells if people are just growing alcohol with it? So we worked over the last 5 years of playing around with off the shelf fermenters, reactors, and other types of newer technologies and processes that were just coming to basically consumer level. And we saw that they can actually perform as good, if not better, than these multi-million dollar reactors that have thousands of ports and electronics built in and take years to basically get built. And we could replace that with a very simple polymer tank with very simple controls that are basically consumer grade. And with that, you can have something that's a fraction, really a hundredth of the price of a traditional reactor, outperform that. So if you could have it cheaper, you could have it faster, you could have it a lot more energy efficient, and you could actually have it deployable basically all over the world with better outputs than the state of the art. We think I stumbled into something really groundbreaking, that you can actually grow things in with biomanufacturing for cheaper than what you could do in the farm. And you could do this with probably a couple thousand tanks. You don't need millions or billions of dollars to make this realistic. And this is what we think is going to be the future of biomanufacturing. Small, quickly deployable systems that could basically produce the vast majority of ingredients without it being undesirable or too expensive.
So in your mind, like if you project out in your vision, balancing obviously knowing how like the realities of cost and the best way to keep costs under control. So is the idea that you imagine California cultured would have like regional hubs of manufacturing facilities, or is it still actually pretty centralized and modular in the sense of, okay, you have one site and then you just continue to build out and build out and build out?
Yeah, so our goal is to produce the highest quality, most competitive chocolate in the world, and that's most likely going to require us to produce in multiple locations. Right now, we're starting in West Sacramento because it is probably the highest concentration of the best plant scientists, food scientists in the world. But sort of after this, we're going to be building other facilities, most likely something in the Midwest, probably as our next big push. And most likely the facility after that would be co-located with some partners. We're basically looking for these large chocolate and coffee manufacturers who don't want to have these complex supply chains spread out all over the world. And if there's a storm here, a port strike there, workers don't show up, just causes delays. And we think, as well as what we've been hearing, the future of a lot of this production is going to be happening as close as physically possible to these production lines. And that's going to require somewhat of a distributed production. And this is what this type of biomanufacturing is really perfect for: mass producing it anywhere in the world and setting up these production areas to feed into these mass production lines of products.
Yeah, it's interesting. The co-location model just makes sense, right? Like logical sense if you're selling an ingredient and if you're able to bypass, basically you're able to just do from the beginning to end in a tank right next to where they're actually making the finished product. It's a pretty easy sell. Much harder
Exactly.
said than done, but pretty. So you said you didn't answer my question, so I got to come back to it. What is the most difficult part? But
It's
or is
yeah,
it all like I said?
it's
They all have their own challenges. I know they're all very
they
different.
all have their own
Okay.
challenges, but it's honestly just showing people and getting people to believe that there is a much better way of biomanufacturing compared to potentially even what was out there and the state of the art. And that is one of our big challenges, showing that we could do it for the right price, the right flavor, and to do it at scale. And that's probably going to be our next big challenge.
Yeah, it's interesting. It's most of the companies I've spoken to and looked at, even on the investing side and then in the biomanufacturing world. I was always challenged by that, where it was like there was often not a very novel approach to the tools that they were using that would actually affect the unit economics and the unit cost. And we still haven't seen it. I think there's a couple of there's some new interesting tools coming out now around like lower cost lab automation, and obviously with AI and a variety of biology focused LLMs. A lot of interesting stuff's coming that's going to help speed up the strain engineering and the R&D. But I just was always been very challenged. Most folks don't take a kind of first principles approach to saying, how do we, it hasn't worked to date, generally speaking, the way that people have been approached trying to bring a more commodity style ingredient to market. So you're going to have to figure out an alternative way. So I'm glad to hear you guys are, have taken that kind of low cost first principles approach to like saying what is even possible with what is existing today. So how what generation chocolate are you on when you made your first when you made your first chocolate?
Currently, we're in our sixth generation of chocolate,
Okay.
but this was a very big, profound one. We've sort of figured out a new way of creating cell lines. We call it our special edition chocolates. Basically, this allows us to produce high amounts of fats of real cocoa butters in our cells, and which is a very big breakthrough in this technology. Just there hasn't really been that many reported scientific papers that anyone has been able to produce this high level. And this is a big far cry from when we began. Our chocolate all the way in the beginning maybe tasted like snot, and maybe that was like our V1. And then we got it better and better and better. If you think about like a whole bunch of plant cells all loosely connected together, and that's basically what it was. But now that we've advanced very far, the cells look amazing. They look basically identical to all cocoa cells under a microscope. They have everything that you would usually find in a cocoa cell, which is really great. The only difference is we can actually control the caffeine levels. So you could actually have like a chocolate that doesn't produce any of these alkaloids, which can actually make it better for people who want to have chocolate at night, who are sensitive to it, or for kids who get hyper after eating chocolate, or for even pregnant women who are trying to avoid caffeine. And this is technically one of the first, what we think, safest chocolates for any dog family whose dogs tend to usually jump for chocolates, since this has zero theobromine in it too. So there's been a lot of advances that we've been able to have, and what we're also excited in is making the ability to control these flavors. So you could have a really high end floral flavor, but also mixing that with more of a traditional milk flavor at the same time, which usually has not been done. So we want to basically showcase the amazing premium flavors, but in a more commonly tasted product.
Yeah, like my mind goes to this like future where you're like you can kind of like design your own flavor profile of chocolate or what. How big's the team? now?
Right now, we have about 18 people.
Okay.
We're mostly pretty heavily science backed. Most of the team is scientists. A couple of people are within the biz dev. And how it sort of works is the scientists work incredibly hard making the cells, making them work great. But when it comes with biz dev, it's we all have like six different hats. One day, you have to pitch to raise some money. Other day, you have to figure out, how you can move faster in science or development or working out business deals or then figuring out chemistry of flavors. So there's a lot of different parts that basically get thrown at us. Or how could we scale faster? How can we make sure that we bring in more amazing talent to tackle these challenges that no one else has cracked before? So it's we've seen that for our science team is more focused on a couple of things, whereas our biz dev team basically has like 5 to 6 things each, and that's sort of the only way that some of these small companies can really
Sure.
achieve these goals without spending tons of money.
Yeah, I think I was out at your lab in 2023. It was, yeah, that's right. And I was honestly, I don't know what generation chocolate that was, but I'm a big chocolate guy. Like I eat a fair amount of dark chocolate, and I was impressed with the flavor profile back then. So I'm excited to get the next generation.
Yeah, it's what we think it stands head over heels on top of it, and we think it's probably a couple of months away
Hmm.
from starting to compete in some of the competitions that we
Cool.
that we basically are looking at, and we think that's probably going to be one of the big wins of trying to rank at least, maybe aiming for a bronze at least in one of these competitions that we're going to submit our chocolate blindly with.
That's great. How did you get into this? Just give a little bit of the background. Obviously, you're technical. It's
Oh
not a
yeah.
scientist.
Yeah, so
So yeah, give folks a little background.
I've been working sort of in the cell culture space for basically my entire career. I started basically all the way in undergrad. I found myself working in one of the first cell culture meat labs in the world. It was in a tiny lab in Bayshore, Long Island, working on cell cultured fish. And the only ones at that time that were brave enough to give us money was NASA for the vision of, you're not going to have giant fish tanks on the space station or on Mars. So how are you going to be able to grow, your favorite tuna or salmon or whatever wherever you go? So the idea was to just grow it in these bioreactors, and that's sort of how I got into it. We wanted to start a company at this time, and you can't imagine of how many investors basically laughed us out of the room because the science was still so young. It had tons of potential, but lots of things had to be figured out. After that, I sort of went to different labs, studied biology, chemistry, worked on a in the lab in Columbia University designing different chelation biologics for kidney disease. And that inspired me to start my first food tech company, originally called Miraculix, in a basement in Harlem. Now it's called Oobly Foods, which focused on pioneering sweeteners that could be produced from proteins. So during my work, I heard upon this super rare plant growing in middle of the jungle in Africa that sort of can trick human, that could trick primates' taste to thinking it's sweet while in reality it's a protein. So we worked really hard over about 7 years to develop this technology, which became these protein sweetener platforms that allowed us to produce these proteins using precision fermentation that can allow us to make all these new types of sweeteners that are what we think more powerful than the sweeteners that you're used to, healthier than what exists, and could be a lot more price competitive. So cleaner, better, and domestically produced. And this is a really exciting technology that can allow lots of people to enjoy the foods they want without the caloric impact, without worrying about if it could induce diabetes. And we were very excited about launching that. And now they have a couple of products and big partnerships out there. I left that in 2020 to pursue California cultured because I just saw the demands for chocolate and coffee were just so large and completely unmet. And we saw that we could sort of take a lot of this technology, ironically, that was built around COVID and COVID testing, and actually make this work to actually start screening plant cells for the compounds that we want. So we basically took all these different technologies that we're developing, and we saw this was the perfect time to basically build a company and commercialize these type of ingredients. And we were very lucky, came in the right time and then the right place. And our sort of work saw that over the next couple of years we were going to see massive price increases in chocolate and coffee, and they're just starting to happen right now.
When you say the technologies were coming together that got you excited, I guess more like put it with your scientist hat on, right? Just dig into that a little bit more. I think it's important for people to understand versus just the broad idea of technologies coming together for screening compounds.
Sure. So, one of the big things that unfortunately has slowed down so many scientists is analytics. You could spend so much time making something, but you could be completely lost because you don't know what's in it, except if you smell it or you taste it or you do some basic stuff to it. You need some really high-end tools to sort of unlock this. And over the last basically couple of years, all these tools that allow scientists to sort of look like what's in here, what compounds or flavors or other things that exist have come down a lot in price. And even the analytics, for instance, to see if we have this type of compound would be very expensive to produce. But ironically, UC Davis, as well as different universities, developed all these very inexpensive assays to basically look for disease and other things. But the same type of initial technology can also allow companies like us to look for other types of compounds or other different signals in what we're looking for. And we could do this at a much, much larger and faster pace than ever been done before. This basically sort of allows us to have like 100 scientists for the price of one doing the specific thing. And this massive technology unlock, I think, allows this type of technology as well as others to finally become feasible as a target to do.
You know, the concept of cell based anything for most people, whether it's cell based meat, cell based chocolate, cell based whatever, you know, it sounds very futuristic and like not natural. So, like, how how do we normalize this or educate the consumer, especially when the vast majority of 54% of Americans, I believe, read at below a sixth grade level?
Yeah, that is a great question. We basically think the best way to showcase this is to literally bring in reporters, bring in consumers, seeing every single step of this process, having them ask questions, showing them the data of how clean it is, of all the compounds. We believe that unfortunately many companies have been hiding like to hide things because obviously it's for IP and it makes them more competitive. But unfortunately, doing that, you lose almost all the trust of the consumers out there. And we think the only way to gain trust is to literally show every single step of this process that they could see it, they could understand it, and they can basically see it's relatively straightforward. And like our sort of ideas of how we explain the technology. It's sort of a mix between growing a potted plant and fermenting beer. So we basically have to do both of these things together to grow chocolate. So we have to go from basically one bucket to a larger bucket to a larger bucket instead of months to years. This takes a couple of days. And then when it comes with fermentation, people know you feed sugar, you have to monitor like air, gas, the cells grow, they eat the sugar, they grow and divide, and then you have your product. And that's sort of the same parable that we like to use for how we're growing it. So as you said, Jordan, you have to make it very simple, very understandable, very relatable to people. And we think the only way for consumers to really have trust is to basically literally kick the tire, see what's there, ask questions, and to feel like and to see and to understand how straightforward it is. And this is what this technology can allow.
What actually is the production timeline from when you start with a cell and then when you're actually growing it in a tank? And I know you're just starting to scale up some production, but what is that production timeline?
So if you want to think about it as it takes it takes about a couple of days to go from one tank to another tank. So right now we basically have a couple of very, very small tanks just always running. And anytime we want to grow, we take that, then we put that into something about 2 to 3 times as big. We wait a week. Then we put that also into 2 to 3 times as big, wait a week. And we could do that forever. So right now, we basically are going maybe about 5 to 6 jumps up in size. And we have a couple thousand-liter tank, which is about a couple hundred gallons, that is operational, and that's sort of our production tank. So if you think about going from like a small pot to a big pot to a bigger pot, we can basically do that transition every week, and the cocoa gets bigger and bigger and bigger during that time. So
Okay.
roughly, it can take us about a week to go from some of our small tanks
Mm-hmm.
to a large tank, and then it takes a week to go from a large tank to basically a finished product.
Okay, so the downstream's pretty quick. And so just gives folks a sense of from a production standpoint. So you're starting with the flavanol. I've called it flavonoid earlier, flavanol.
Yes.
And so is it, kind of as you think about the end of this year, then going into next year, like how does production scale up based upon your projections?
Yeah, so our goal for the end of this year is to have a couple of our large tanks operational just to validate the technology and to showcase it could produce the tonnage necessary. By mid 2026, we're looking to have about 12 of our tanks operational. Towards the end of 2026, about 24. So we're looking to almost double our capacity every 6 to 8 months, and starting to produce significant tonnage by next year. And by probably 2028, we're going to be in the hundreds of tons, and probably close to 2030, we'll be in the tens of thousands of tons. So that's a little bit of our trajectory of where we think we're going to be able to grow.
And the flavanol, do you sell it like, is it like a liquid, or how do you get it to your customers, in what format?
Yeah, so it is in a cocoa powder.
Okay.
Since we're able to grow the cocoa cells in different quantities, we figure out how to trick the cocoa cell where it usually would produce about 1% of its weight in flavanols. We've been tricking the cells to get up to 20% of its weight. So over 20x improvement in concentration. And that means you don't have to crack it open or use any dangerous or expensive chemical process to separate it. We're able to basically grow it in the cell, rinse it, and basically add it to cocoa powders, to chocolates, to your protein smoothies that you might have in the morning, or other applications somewhat like that. So it's most likely going to come in a powderized or in a chocolate or in a semi finished application. So you're going to have it, but it could come in many different formats.
Great. Are you ready to do a little rapid fire as we wrap up?
Sure.
All right. Chocolate or, or cocoa, which word should survive?
Chocolate.
The biggest myth about lab grown anything or cell based agriculture.
It's a lot more cleaner than what you could get on the farm.
Hardest problem in scaling food biotech in one word.
Getting people to buy it again.
The future of food, centralized or decentralized production.
Very decentralized.
Finish the sentence. Chocolate will one day be made in.
Your home.
Great. Thanks, Alan. I appreciate the time, my man.
All right. Thanks, Jordan.
Take care.
Take care. Bye.